Nicole Kidman spoke about Tommy Lee Jones in a way that few people in Hollywood ever do. Not through headlines, not through controversy, but through quiet observations that challenge how he has been publicly perceived for years. What she shared didn't reveal a scandal. It revealed a contrast. And that contrast is what makes this story worth paying attention to. According to accounts from within the industry, the conversation took place away from cameras, premieres, and press obligations. It wasn't an interview moment. It wasn't meant for public reaction. It was a reflection on how certain figures in Hollywood are often misunderstood because they refuse to perform outside their work. Nicole Kidman reportedly described Tommy Lee Jones as someone whose public image never fully matched the person behind it. To audiences, he has long appeared distant, intense, and emotionally reserved. But in private professional settings, that same distance was often interpreted very differently. She pointed out that Jones belonged to a generation of actors shaped by discipline rather than exposure, a time when presence was built on preparation, not accessibility, where silence wasn't a strategy but a habit. What stood out most in her account was not praise but clarity. She suggested that many assumptions made about him were formed not by his actions but by his refusal to explain himself. And in an industry that thrives on explanation, that refusal became a story of its own. As this perspective circulated quietly, it raised an uncomfortable question. If a public image is shaped by absence rather than behavior, how much of it is actually true? As the conversation continued, Nicole Kidman reportedly shifted from image to impact. She spoke about moments on set where Tommy Lee Jones' approach influenced the entire atmosphere of a production without him ever raising his voice or demanding attention. According to those present, she described a working style built on boundaries, clear expectations, minimal explanations, an understanding that professionalism didn't need to be performed to be felt. What made her account resonate was the timing. It surfaced during a period when public discussion around Jones had grown quieter, while private speculation had grown louder. In that silence, assumptions filled the gap. Kidman allegedly acknowledged that she had once misunderstood him herself, not because of anything he said or did, but because of what he chose not to engage with. Over time, she realized that his distance was less about detachment and more about protection. She also reportedly touched on the weight carried by actors whose careers spanned decades. Not just the pressure to remain relevant, but the responsibility of having their private lives interpreted by strangers. In her view, Jones handled that weight by narrowing his focus rather than expanding his visibility. This is where her perspective became more personal. She suggested that loss and responsibility can reshape how someone moves through public spaces. Not visibly, not dramatically, but through restraint. That observation reframed earlier narratives. What had once been labeled as coldness could also be seen as containment, a way of maintaining control in an environment that constantly pushes for access. And it left one quiet implication hanging in the background. Sometimes, what looks like distance is simply a decision to endure privately. As Nicole Kidman's perspective continued to circulate among industry circles, it didn't trigger public statements or formal responses. Instead, it prompted something quieter but more enduring: re-evaluation. People who had worked with Tommy Lee Jones across different decades reportedly began revisiting their own experiences, not to contradict what had been said, but to add dimension to it. The pattern that emerged was consistent rather than dramatic. He was described as precise, predictable in his standards, uninterested in hierarchy, but deeply invested in competence. Several collaborators reportedly echoed the same observation. Jones rarely spoke about himself, but always spoke clearly about the work. There was no separation between preparation and performance. What happened before the camera mattered just as much as what appeared on screen. Nicole Kidman's account allegedly highlighted how rare that mindset had become, in an industry increasingly shaped by visibility, commentary, and constant presence. Jones represented something older, a model where credibility was built through consistency rather than narrative. She reportedly noted that this difference often caused friction, not because of conflict, but because of misunderstanding. Silence was misread as judgment, focus was mistaken for detachment, and boundaries were interpreted as rejection. What made her reflection resonate was that it did not attempt to correct public opinion directly. It simply added context where context had been missing. At one point, according to those familiar with the conversation, Kidman addressed the way personal hardship reshapes public figures, not in obvious ways, but in how they choose what to share and what to protect. She suggested that some actors learn early that exposure does not equal connection. That idea reframed much of the speculation surrounding Jones over the years. Rather than being inaccessible, he may have been selective, rather than distant, intentional. As the discussion expanded, it became clear that this wasn't just about one actor. It was about how Hollywood interprets restraint. In an environment that rewards openness, restraint often looks suspicious. In a culture driven by constant updates, consistency can feel invisible. And when someone refuses to explain themselves repeatedly, the explanation is often invented for them. Nicole Kidman reportedly acknowledged this pattern directly. She observed that audiences rarely notice what is missing until something interrupts their expectations. And when that interruption happens, it creates space for reinterpretation. That space is where her comments landed. They did not accuse. They did not defend. They contextualized. This distinction mattered because context invites understanding while defense invites debate. As the industry quietly absorbed this perspective, it raised another question. How many narratives persist simply because no one pauses long enough to reconsider them? Jones' career, when viewed through this lens, appeared less enigmatic and more consistent. A body of work defined by control rather than chaos, by choices rather than reactions. Kidman reportedly pointed out that longevity in Hollywood often depends on knowing when not to speak, when not to respond, when not to participate in cycles that demand emotional access without offering protection. She suggested that Jones mastered this balance early, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. This interpretation reframed moments that had previously been misunderstood. Short answers in interviews, limited public appearances, a reluctance to engage beyond professional obligations. Seen through Kidman's perspective, these were not absences, they were decisions. As more people reflected on this, the conversation subtly shifted from personality to process, from image to structure, and that shift made room for a broader realization. Hollywood often confuses visibility with transparency, but the two are not the same. Visibility can be manufactured, transparency cannot. According to those close to the discussion, Kidman emphasized that transparency does not require constant explanation. Sometimes it exists in consistency over time, in actions that never contradict each other, in boundaries that remain steady regardless of external pressure. Jones' career, she suggested, reflected exactly that. As the story continued to evolve quietly, it became less about what was revealed and more about what was reconsidered. Old interviews were reread. Past interactions were reinterpreted. Silences were no longer automatically filled with assumptions. Instead, they were left as they were. And that restraint changed the tone of the conversation. What emerged was not a revelation, but a recalibration, a reminder that not every truth arrives loudly. Some arrive slowly, through perspective rather than disclosure. This understanding also highlighted a larger issue within celebrity culture, the expectation that public figures owe emotional access in exchange for attention, that absence of commentary equals absence of humanity. Kidman's reported comments challenged that expectation directly, without confrontation. She suggested that privacy is not a refusal to connect, but a method of survival. That idea lingered long after the conversation itself, because it didn't just apply to Tommy Lee Jones. It applied to anyone whose life is constantly interpreted from the outside. As the industry moved forward, this reframing subtly altered how his presence was discussed, not more loudly, but more carefully. And in a space where care is often mistaken for weakness, that shift mattered. The story did not end with answers. It ended with better questions. What Nicole Kidman's perspective ultimately offered was not closure, but clarity, a reminder that understanding often requires stepping back rather than leaning in. As this interpretation continues to circulate, it opens a wider conversation about how we judge public figures by what they withhold rather than what they do, and whether silence should always be treated as a void or sometimes as a boundary. In the next video, we'll explore how similar moments of quiet commentary have reshaped public perception in Hollywood before, and why the most influential narratives are often the ones that never make headlines. What ultimately remains after Nicole Kidman's perspective is not a single takeaway, but a reframing of how stories around public figures are formed in the first place. Not every narrative is built from statements. Some are built from silence, repetition, and the expectations others bring into that silence. In Hollywood, perception often moves faster than understanding. A moment, a gesture, or an absence of explanation can quickly solidify into a permanent label. Once that label exists, it rarely gets questioned, only repeated. Kidman's remarks, as they've been described, interrupted that cycle not by opposing it, but by slowing it down. That slowdown matters, because when attention pauses, context has room to surface, and context changes how behavior is interpreted. What once looked like distance can begin to look like discipline. What once felt unapproachable can begin to feel intentional. This shift does not rewrite history. It does not erase past impressions or demand that audiences rethink every assumption they've ever made. Instead, it introduces balance, something often missing when private individuals are viewed through public lenses. Tommy Lee Jones' career has unfolded largely without commentary about his inner world. That absence has been interpreted in many ways over the years. But what Kidman's perspective adds is the possibility that restraint itself can be a form of communication. Not everything meaningful is verbalized. Not every boundary is defensive, and not every quiet presence signals detachment. For viewers, this raises a broader consideration. How often do we confuse familiarity with truth? How often do we assume that knowing more details would automatically lead to better understanding? In reality, access does not always equal insight. Sometimes, the more information circulates, the less clarity remains. That paradox sits at the center of modern celebrity culture, where constant updates can obscure rather than illuminate. This story, as it stands, doesn't push toward resolution. It doesn't promise revelations or hidden details waiting to be uncovered. Instead, it encourages a different kind of engagement, one rooted in patience rather than immediacy. The most responsible interpretations often come after attention fades, not while it peaks. When reactions settle, when speculation quiets, when narratives are allowed to mature instead of being forced into conclusions, that is why this moment feels less like an ending and more like a pause, a space between assumptions and understanding. For audiences accustomed to fast-moving explanations, that pause can feel uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't always negative. Sometimes it signals that a story is being handled with care rather than urgency. And care, especially in stories involving real people and real lives, changes everything. As conversations like this continue to surface, they slowly reshape how we interpret the relationship between public work and private identity. They challenge the idea that visibility is a requirement for credibility. And they remind us that choosing not to speak can be as deliberate as choosing to speak openly. Looking ahead, this perspective opens the door to a wider examination of Hollywood itself, not as a place of constant drama, but as an environment where survival often depends on boundaries that are invisible from the outside. In the next video, we'll expand on that idea. We'll look at other moments where quiet observations from within the industry subtly altered public narratives, not through exposure, but through context. And we'll explore why restraint, when understood correctly, can reveal more about power, longevity, and identity than any headline ever could.